today we're making a chicken and shrimp Alfredo pizza. This is going to be something that you've probably never had before, but I guarantee you it's going to be really, really good. Let's get started. Alright, now to make this pizza, first thing you're going to need, of course, is pizza dough. Obviously, you can use a prefab one if you can find one, or a pre-made crust like Boboli. You could use a tortilla if you really wanted to, though you may not have the best results. This is, of course, our homemade pizza dough, which the recipe will be linked down in the description below. Then we're going to be making the sauce from scratch. We're doing an Alfredo sauce. You can, of course, just use pre-made jarred Alfredo sauce, or if you have your own recipe that you prefer for Alfredo sauce, that's perfectly fine. Any of those things are going to work, but you're still going to want to put some of the same ingredients in there. So to make this Alfredo sauce, we have to make a roux to start, which requires some flour and some butter. It's going to be about a 1/4 cup of flour and about half a stick of butter, so it's about equal parts of both. Then with that, we're going to be doing a can of evaporated milk. You can use regular milk, that's perfectly fine, but evaporated milk, I find it's a good amount, and it's better than using up the milk that we have in the fridge, especially since my kids drink a ton of it. Then, of course, you're going to need some Parmesan cheese. And because that's just for making a basic Alfredo sauce, we're going a little bit more complicated than that because of the fact that we want this to be a bit more interesting. And furthermore, we want to make it so that it's not quite as rich, so that it complements the shrimp really well. So along with those, we're also going to need about half of a yellow onion, 5 cloves of garlic, and then we're also going to be adding a full drained can of Rotel tomatoes. Now, of course, you can use fresh tomatoes. You don't have to use the ones with chilies in them. It's perfectly fine. Any type of tomatoes will work perfectly fine. The main thing is the tomatoes will lighten up the Alfredo sauce, and that will really help to cut through the richness when it comes to dealing with having the shrimp on the pizza. All right, then for the toppings on the pizza, first we're going to need about 8 ounces each of chicken and shrimp. You can use any kind you want. If you want to use pre-cooked chicken, pre-cooked shrimp, that's perfectly fine. It will work just fine. Of course, down in the description below, I'll have our recipe for grilled chicken linked. But we're just going to go ahead and, for the purposes of demonstration, we'll show you how this chicken is going to be cooked if you don't already have some pre-made or purchased that's already pre-cooked. Additionally, we're also going to need some bacon. I have about 5 ounces here. You don't necessarily have to do as much as we're doing. This is, of course, our homemade bacon. You can just as easily use pre-cooked bacon bits in place of actually cooking up some bacon strips, but we are going to use, of course, the homemade bacon because we have it available. Then, of course, you're going to need, which should have even come first realistically, some mozzarella cheese. We're using about 8 ounces of this block, but that is about all you need. You can obviously do more or less depending on your liking. Then we are going to, these are more optional ingredients, but we're going to put some mushrooms on top, as well as some sliced olives. These obviously are not sliced yet, but we will slice them. And we'll get all that stuff together, and we'll put the pizza together. Get this started, we're going to toss in our bacon. Reminder, I'm doing about 5 ounces. You can do more or less depending on how you prefer it. You're basically just wanting to get this browned up just like you would with bacon any other time that you're cooking it. And we'll use the bacon fat for cooking most of the other stuff. For cooking the chicken, for cooking the shrimp, and adding some additional flavor to the sauce. Obviously, if you don't have an Instant Pot, you can easily just do this on the stove. One thing to keep in mind is that if you like your bacon really crispy, don't get it extra crispy in here, because The idea is you're going to cook it almost entirely here in the Instant Pot just to get it cooked up, and then it will cook the rest of the way in the oven on top of the pizza. You notice there's lots of like little bits stuck to the bottom there. Don't worry about that, because the fact of the matter is that between the chicken and the shrimp, it will probably end up taking up a lot of that, and whatever it doesn't take up will be taken up by the onions, which is the reason why we're doing all of this in the same pan. It's a good pro tip that I learned a while ago. Onions do a great job taking care of any leftover proteins that get stuck to the bottom of a pan of any kind, Instant Pot or otherwise. Alright, now that's about where we want it to be. Even though it might look, okay, that's a little pink, trust me, it's fully cooked. This was already cooked in the smoker, basically, cooked to a safe eating temperature. But we got it a little bit crispy. It'll crisp up the rest of the way in the oven, which will be cooking at a very high temperature. So just get all those scraps of bacon out and set them aside. And then we'll get started cooking the chicken. Now for the chicken, all we're going to use to season it is some seasoning salt, any brand will do fine, and some black pepper. I don't have precise measurements, really just kind of guesstimate. And I just want to note, anytime you're cooking chicken, to put in anything, whether you're putting it on a pizza, in pasta, whatever, anytime you're doing chopped up cooked chicken, you can't go wrong with seasoning salt and black pepper for the seasonings. You can do even just plain salt and pepper. Any of those things will work just fine. There's obviously lots of other options as well, but we're keeping it simple. And this always works. And as I said before, down in the description below, there will be linked a recipe for our grilled chicken, which normally is what I would actually use on the pizza because it's already cooked up. There's a ton of it already made. So really all I would have to do is at most defrost and then cut some up to put on top of the pizza. But this time we're going a little more fancy schmancy with everything. So we're going to go ahead and cook this up. The chicken's all done cooking, so we're going to go ahead and put that into its own separate clean plate that did not have raw meat in it. Don't worry too much if you have any extra juices, because once again, these things will be used for cooking up everything else. So now we'll go ahead and set that aside and then add the shrimp. And the shrimp, we're not even going to do much of anything to season this either. Same thing, just a tiny bit of seasoning salt, not much. A little bit of black pepper. And that's all. And just basically cook them until they're pink. Keep in mind with the shrimp, because of the fact that it's going to go on top of the pizza and into the oven, it's okay to leave it a little bit undercooked. Just don't do too undercooked, because you don't want it, because otherwise it'll just leave behind a bunch of liquid and then it won't end up being, it'll just kind of mess with the pizza. Shrimp really only needs a couple minutes, especially if the pan's hot. You just want to cook it until it's no longer translucent, which is basically there now. So we're going to go ahead and pull that out, add it to the plate with our chicken, as well will go on the pizza at the same time. All right, and then now we'll go ahead and get started cooking our onions and then our garlic. So I recommend not putting the garlic in until the onions have had a chance to saute for a bit. But we're going to cook some of the onions, and you probably noticed that I chopped up the onions pretty finely. They're not like extremely finely chopped, but once again, we're trying to lighten up the sauce a bit because of the fact that the shrimp with Alfredo sauce tends to be really on the rich side. So we'll saute the onions for a little bit. And of course, if you are low on fat left from like the chicken and the bacon and things like that, you can always toss in a little bit of avocado oil or butter here, but it's really not absolutely necessary. We're not too worried about it. There was enough there that we could work with. But just as we did with the chicken and the shrimp and the bacon, we're going to end up separating all of these. We are going to throw them back in after the Alfredo is more put together, but we don't want any of these to interfere with making the roux. So we're just going to get them in to get them sauteed a bit first. I think that's sufficiently sauteed. Now we'll go ahead and toss in the garlic. You can chop it, as I did, or you can very simply just use a garlic press. I don't recommend using pre-chopped or pre-minced garlic, mostly because the stuff that they add to keep it fresh, it honestly just takes away from the flavor. I find that typically the best flavor you can get is either if you get like really completely fresh garlic cloves, or if you do like I do and just get a bag of pre-peeled garlic cloves, and you can put them in the freezer and then just pull them out as you need them. They can literally last for years. I had one time where I actually had some last for multiple years before I had to move on past it. So, alright, I think that is about done. It's nice and fragrant. Good opportunity to get it pulled out, and that way we can get our roux going. And actually, slight correction on that. We're not going to do the roux just yet. We're going to saute the Rotel tomatoes as well, because that just helps bring out more of the flavor and makes them taste a little bit less like they're canned. So get all the rest of that out. Yeah, there's some burnt bits on the bottom, but don't worry too much about that. That'll all get cleaned up pretty well when you get everything else going. Of course, once again, with the Rotel tomatoes, I recommend draining them beforehand so that you don't end up with a bunch of extra liquid. You basically just want to get these sauteed. Now, one thing I do want to note is we're going to make enough Alfredo sauce that there will be extra, but it's basically just so that way you can... It's a little bit easier to make a larger recipe and then have an extra that you can use for something else, like, for example, pasta, than trying to make a smaller batch and potentially not having enough and then having to make more. It's not really worth the extra effort from that standpoint. So we got all that. Now we're going to go ahead and add those to the garlic and tomatoes, or garlic and onions. One problem with doing this in the Instant Pot, though, is it's not always as easy to retrieve everything out of there, but I think it's good enough at this point. So we'll go ahead and get started with the roux. So start with half a stick of butter. You can use a full stick if you want, but half a stick seems to usually be enough. Just want to get the butter melted. I am using salted butter, by the way, just because that's what we have, and typically that's what I use. Doesn't really matter too much if you use one or the other, but just wanted to make note of that. And we'll add our 1/4 cup of flour. Start mixing that in. good roux going. Now we'll go ahead and add that full can of evaporated milk. And at this point, if you don't already have one out, you'll want to get out a whisk. Just using the spatula to scrape the stuff off the sides first. And basically you just want to heat and whisk this until it starts to thicken. And at that point, we'll add our cheese. And everything else. See, it's thickening nicely. So now we're going to add our cheese. I have about 112 grams or 4 ounces. It's going to be really thick to start, but we'll add some liquid to it to help it thin out a bit after we add the onions and the tomatoes and the garlic. So now we'll just add all of those in at once. Those on their own are going to help thin things out a little bit. Now, if I was making this for pasta, I would be adding some pasta water from cooking the pasta. Since I don't have that, I'm just going to be adding some regular water. Now, of course, you can completely skip the roux and just do some heavy cream. I personally prefer not doing heavy cream. And you could do milk instead of water, but realistically, this is going to be rather rich on its own. So I'm starting with about half a cup of water and then getting that stirred around. That'll help to thin things out so that it's not quite so thick, because you don't want it to be so thick that you can't basically you can't spread it or anything else. You want it to be thin enough that it's actually usable as a sauce. I mean, right now it's already looking really good, but it will probably thicken up some more. When you're using pasta water, you have to add quite a lot of it, because the pasta water will naturally have some starch in it from the pasta, and that'll thicken it further. But right here, like right now, this is a pretty good thickness. I think it could stand to be a little thinner because it's still going to thicken up a little bit. So we're just going to go ahead and add the rest of that half cup, or that remaining half cup of water. I know it looks really thin right now, but it's going to thicken up. All right, after that's pretty well mixed, you can just stir it up a bit. I recommend giving it a taste test before you finalize it, just to make sure if you need to add any additional salt and pepper or anything else to it. Just do it to your liking. Now, as it stands right now, it does need a bit more salt. You could technically add more cheese, but I don't typically do that because adding more cheese just makes it get thicker, and then it ends up being unnecessarily thick and doesn't really help the flavor. In reality, it just makes it overly rich. A bit more pepper and a little more salt. All right, taste. Yeah, and that's pretty much perfect as far as flavor goes. We're gonna let that sit and simmer for a little bit, but then we'll go ahead and get started actually assembling the pizza. All right, now I should note, in case it's not obvious, always make sure that when you are doing this on a pizza stone especially, and having to assemble it on your cutting board, that you make sure you put down lots of cornmeal beforehand, because otherwise it's gonna be really hard to get it onto your pizza peel. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and start assembling our pizza. I do wanna make a couple notes here. First of all, I'm doing this on the cutting board, but if you, basically this is the best way to do it if you are using something like a pizza stone or one of those cast iron pizza plates, which is what I'm using today. If you are not, you can obviously just do this directly on the pizza pan, but I do not recommend putting it on the pizza pan if you are doing it on a pizza stone or anything, because then it's much harder to get it onto the peel to slide it into the oven. As far as the cook times go, temperature and everything else, if you're using a pizza stone or a cast iron pizza plate, you're going to be cooking it at 550 for about 6 minutes, and then put the broiler on high for like the last 2 minutes in order to get it done. And at least that's what it is with a typical conventional oven. If you are not using a pizza pan or a pizza stone, 375, and you'll do it for about 15 minutes. So let's go ahead and get started with assembly. We're going to use obviously our homemade Alfredo sauce that we just made. There's a lot here, and see it thickened up really nicely. We're going to use roughly about half a cup of that, but you can obviously just use as much or as little as you like. I like to go pretty generous. All right, and then we're going to do about 8 ounces or roughly 224 grams of mozzarella cheese. Actually, we'll save a little bit of that so we can put it on top of the chicken and shrimp. Then we'll add our chicken and our shrimp. And as I said before, you can obviously just use whatever kind of cooked chicken that you want. It doesn't have to be chicken thighs, it can be chicken breasts. You can use pre-cooked grilled chicken if you've followed my recipe here before, or just do the same method, but you know, whichever way you want to do it. Any of those things are going to work great. You can obviously, like I said, just use like the pre-cooked stuff that you buy in the freezer section. That'll work perfectly fine. And you can use more or less of it, but I typically like to load up my pizzas pretty heavily. And even with a pizza stone, once you got the technique down, loading up a pizza isn't going to hurt anything. And we'll put our shrimp on. Ended up looking prettier than I was expecting. Then we'll toss on the rest of our cheese. That'll also help to keep the shrimp from overcooking, although it should be fine regardless. Then we'll do our mushrooms. And keep in mind, these mushrooms are going to shrink quite a bit. Now, in this case, I'm using just plain white mushrooms. Normally, I'll use baby Bella mushrooms because they don't produce quite as much moisture. But because of how hot we're cooking this, it's not going to matter nearly as much. So we're going to just go ahead and do reasonable amount on here. Not going to be quite as much as like we did on our Philly cheesesteak pizza, for example, because that does just produce a lot of moisture. But we'll still spread them around pretty reasonably. Then we'll put on our olives, our black olives. And I forgot to slice these while recording, so I ended up slicing them off separately, but I think that you can probably figure out how to slice olives, and if you can't, just get pre-sliced ones. And then finally, the coup de grace. Top it with that bacon. We're gonna have probably way more bacon than we actually need, but I mean, come on, it's bacon. And it's homemade bacon, which makes it even better. And it looks absolutely gorgeous. I could stand spread out a little bit more, but it's still going to be incredible. Alright, now my technique is not perfect on this, but we can still kind of slide it under and then just like very gently slide it on. When it comes to actually getting it in the oven, it goes a lot better than it does getting it on here, but I kind of like rotate it a little bit when I do that. Tell you one thing though, if you get the technique right, this is just a game changer when it comes to pizza, and you'll see how it looks when the final pizza comes out and compare it to all the previous pizza recipes we've done here on the channel. It's unbelievable how much better it looks. So we're gonna go ahead and get this into our 550-degree oven on that pizza stone, and it's gonna cook for about 6 minutes at 550. Then we will switch it over to the broiler on high, and we will cook it for 2 more minutes. And then we'll pull this back out, and you'll get to see the final product. Now the taste test. Oh man, doesn't that look amazing? Got that beautiful homemade Alfredo sauce and the chicken and the shrimp and the olives and mushrooms and the bacon, the homemade bacon. Of course, that amazing crust.
Oh man. Mmm. Mushy. Mmm. The shrimp, the seasonings on the shrimp go so perfectly with that Alfredo. The pizza crust has a perfect crunch to it. Mmm. That's so good. And I'm hungry. That's good.
Alright, so let's give this a shot. Man, I gotta pick a good looking slice. I guess we'll just go with this one since it's right here. Already zoomed in a bit from your slice. Stuff's kind of falling off, but man, it looks amazing. Okay, let's give this a try. Man. Oh my goodness. It's just like everything's kind of falling off the pizza, but unlike the other pizzas we made, because we're using this cast iron pizza plate, the crust actually ends up really crispy on the bottom, so it's not like drooping down, it's just stuff falling off because I put a lot of toppings on. But even though you can absolutely you can absolutely just use pre-made Alfredo sauce, I'm telling you, make the homemade stuff. It's really good. And even if you don't make it homemade, at the very least make sure that you do the sauteed onions and garlic and tomatoes, because man, it just makes such a huge difference in the flavor, and just like all these flavors together, it's unbelievable. I mean, yes, it's very loaded, I know. Probably could be less loaded, but it tastes so good that it doesn't even matter. Thanks for watching. Please leave a like if you liked this video, subscribe to the channel and share with your friends, and stay tuned for more recipes that, while not necessarily authentic, are always delicious. It's going to be about a 1/4 cup of flour and about you want to do 325, and you'll do it roughly, yes, 325, and you'll do it for no, that's not right. As Homestar Runner would say, de coupe de gauze. Now spin my buzzle. Your what? My buzzle. Give it a spin. Oh, why am I doing this? Oh, you just said doing again. Okay. Do 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 do. You're singing the theme from Night Court? No, not singing. When you spin my buzzle, it plays the theme from Night Court, starring Richard Mole, and it's custom installed.